Hi all, welcome to Introduction to Scratch Building Part 1. I'm the L-mos engine, and today we're going to go over how to basically scratch build your own parts. Whether you want to make them for your models just to snap them on, or to make them castable so that you can recreate more of them. We're going to go over some basic tools you're going to need. We're going to go over how to make a basic form, how to add detail, and how to clean it up and get it ready for priming to make the part ready to use. First off, we're going to need this later on, but I would suggest that you have some sort of ruler that can make perfect circles, or close to them as you can get. We're going to use this to trace some rounded parts that we're going to have to sand, and we want to guide while we're doing it. You're going to need plastic, basic rectangular rod plastic. This particular one is made by a company called Plastruct, and a basic blocky size that I like to use is part number 90800, and it comes in a pretty decent sized chunk that's 4.8 millimeters that we can glue these together to get the block structure that we're going to subtract from, which I'll show you in a few minutes. Next is just some Plastruct or whatever company you want to use, it doesn't really matter. Thin form sheet plastic. We're going to use this to make the facing for what we sculpt on certain parts as a way to make sure we have an even surface for gluing other things on top of it. It's also good for making engravings too if you don't want to do it with an engraving tool. As with anything with hobbies, you're probably going to need a hobby knife. I have X-Actos with 100 blade packs that are pretty cheap to come by. And a good X-Acto knife set goes a long way. Just, basic knife set. Next, we're going to need razor blades. I always use these. I would put in the caveat, of course, be careful when you're using these. They're quite sharp, as with your hobby knife. Next is going to be sanding tools, some sort of sanding tools. I just have a block of wood that's, pretty chewed up. But I just wrap sandpaper around it. Some really, really low grit sandpaper for removing a lot of plastic at once. We can use a bunch of other different grits later on for finish sanding, but for starting, we're gonna use one of these. Next is gonna be the most important tool of all, which is your Dremel tool. Doesn't have to be made by Dremel, but just a small rotary tool. One of the bits that I find the most useful for every kind of plastic sculpture is a diamond-coated disc blade. They sound expensive, they're not. They're replaceable, pretty cheap, although it's easy just to keep it clean and keep reusing it. But this is what we're going to use to cut most of our plastic, as it'll chop through plastic like butter, and it makes a pretty clean cut once you learn how to use it. It's also good for beveling and sculpting edges once you learn how to use it. Next is superglue, crazy glue, cyanoacrylate glue. Make sure that it's cyanoacrylate for what we're doing, as it makes a brittle hold, and if you mess up, you can pry the parts open again. Plus it dries and cures pretty quickly as it reacts to moisture in the air. If you use plastic cement, this process will take significantly longer, which is always your option if you want to do that. Next is something I'm sure you've seen before. I got the recommendation from Cam. I'm not sure where he got it or if he thought of it himself, but using baby powder with plastic, with super glue to fill in gaps quickly. You can use putty if you want to, but this will be stronger, and it's a lot easier, quicker, and sort of a better solution that I prefer. Alright, next we're going to take one of our plastic rods, and we're going to make it in roughly the size of the block of the part that we want. Obviously the block is going to have to be bigger than the part in the end, so give yourself a little bit of room to shave down. Alright, the part that I'm going to be making today is going to go on one of the kits that I've made. It's going to be a part for my Lanzegeist on the leg armor. I'm going to make an option part that replaces these turrets with two little small deflectable thrusters. It's going to go right here on this peg, and thus it needs to be about that size to fit on there. So I'm going to measure out the plastic, and then I'm going to go ahead and cut this rod of plastic to be about the size of the part that's going to need to go on here. Just going to create the block footprint of the part that I'm making. Alright, I've gone ahead and marked off all the parts on this plastic that I'm going to need to cut, basically just cut lines. They're about 1.25 inches apart. So that should give me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 blocks of 1.25 inch plastic that I'm going to glue together to make one larger block. Alright. It's always good to have eye protection for these kind of things. I know it sounds dumb, but it's useful. I wear glasses, so that should work for me. Alright, we're going to go ahead and cut these using the Dremel tool and the disc blade. Alright, now that the parts are cut, you can take your extra plastic. I always try to save this when I can. Try not to waste anything, this stuff can get expensive. Pull all of the melted plastic from your cut from these little blocks. Try to separate everything out. Alright, now we have a bunch of little blocks that we're basically going to glue together into a little brick. I'm going to go ahead and pull out another piece of plastic and cut one that's roughly the same size as those, as I want this to be rectangular. Just going to roughly measure that out, mark it with a Sharpie marker, and cut off that extra piece. Okay. Go ahead and return my plastic to the container so that I can use this later. Alright. Now the next thing that I'm going to do in order to make sure that I can glue these together, you'll notice that with all those little rough edges on there, they may not line up snugly, and we need them to be snug when I glue them. So I'm going to go ahead and take my sanding block, or whatever method of sanding you want to use. Bastard files work really well. In fact, I'm probably going to use one of those. This is a bastard file, by the way. Quite useful for smoothing out those edges. Just quickly try to remove any plastic that sticks out so that we can glue these little bricks together snugly. Alright, now that we've got all of our plastic to the point where it should sit pretty snug, you can tell we're pretty snug, we're going to go ahead and glue these together using our super glue. Just go ahead and put a decent amount in the middle. You don't have to coat the entire surface with it, just enough to line the middle to get it to hold. And keep in mind, if there's a little bit of plastic sticking out on the top and the bottom, it's okay because we're going to file that down before we glue the top and the bottom block together. Make sure that's snug. Let that sit while we glue this other one. If you get super glue on your fingers, well, when you get super glue on your fingers, it's alright. Just pull them apart. You can actually file that off of your skin too if you have to. Try not to get your fingers stuck together. Alright. Good thing to always have on hand as well as paper towels. I prefer thicker shop towel type paper towels as they're better absorbent and they don't leave as many fibers behind. Alright, let's go ahead and close our super glue up for a minute. Now, you're going to notice some of these edges aren't exactly flush. So we're going to have to sand those down and file them before we put these two together. Otherwise we're going to have too large of a gap in between there, which we don't want. So let's go ahead and take our really low grit sandpaper. I think this is maybe 600 grit or 300 grit. It's quite low, quite rough. Alright. And don't worry about it, this surface won't actually be showing ever. We're just trying to get the inside smooth enough to where it'll glue tightly. Alright. That should be good enough. Let's pull our super glue back out. We're going to put a liberal amount down so that it stays. Try to keep it a little bit off the edges though if you can. Probably it's not picking this up in the camera. But it's maybe a 1/16 of an inch in. You don't want to have the glue leaking too much out the sides. We're going to go ahead and press those two together. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Wipe off the extra. Alright. And then we're going to go ahead and put our super glue away for a minute. Now we're going to go ahead and sand the edges of this. Do be careful when you're sanding it with low grit sandpaper though, you are going to have to remove all these scratch marks, so try to get it sort of flush, and maybe a bastard file will be a better tool. Alright, the next thing we're going to do, after getting all of our surfaces smooth, which I've just done, again, with using a bastard file to get the surface pretty smooth after using the low-grade sandpaper, we have a block, which, as you can tell, is pretty jagged on the edges. We're going to do two things. We're going to trace the shape of the circle that I want the top to be, sort of rounded, and the bottom needs to be completely flat and flush. So we're going to do those two things. First thing is tracing the circle on top. Now, we just need to find a circle on our ruler here that roughly fits the size that I want. Again, there's no need to be overly perfectionist, just find one that fits roughly the size that you want. Because again, we're going to have to do this by hand, and our handwork isn't going to be perfect. But I've traced roughly a circle on the top, which is going to be my rounded edge. And I'm going to have to trace a line on the bottom for cutting to make sure that it's smooth. So I'm just going to take my straight edge, whatever you want to be, a ruler, razor blade, whatever. I'm just going to line this up with the edge and draw a straight line. Cool. Now, I'm going to cut this rough shape with my diamond disc blade, this as well, and then I'm going to use a sanding blade to, to follow up with afterwards. Alright, now I've cut off the rounded edge a bit. I still am going to need to make sure it's smooth, and I want to add a bit of a bevel so that it's at an angle. This part I'm going to bevel an angle as well, but it's going to be the opposite. So I'm going to change the bit attachment on my Dremel. I have a quick detach head setting, these are actually quite nice. For a sanding bit attachment. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and just sand that edge down some. Alright. Okay, remove the excess. And no worries, you may have noticed this part is pretty thick still, but we're going to be able to remove about 1/4 of that thickness in a little while just using that sanding blade. Although we're going to do it on we are going to do it on the face side, but we're going to put a sheet of smooth plastic on top of it just to make sure that there's no imperfections. That's the quick and easy way. Let me go ahead and do a couple finishing strikes with a bit of sandpaper. Now, while the Dremel tool is quite useful for removing large bits of plastic quite quickly, you're going to want to do some of this stuff by hand just because you have more control. Again, bastard files, quite nice. They will remove a lot of your sanding strokes from the thicker sandpaper, or the low-grade sandpaper. And help to just even this part out some. Much of plastic sculpting is just, just this on different scales, in different shapes. And you'll just make different shapes that stack on top of each other or add to each other. Alright, then the next thing that I've done after smoothing out everything using my bastard file was to use a magic marker and just kind of trace around the edges, letting me know how thick I need to shave this down to make the part about the thickness that I want. So we're just going to use our sanding bit on our Dremel and then shave the plastic down until that marker's gone. I'm going to shave this down a little bit more, clean it up, and then we'll move on to adding the bevel. Alright, the next thing we're going to do is add a bevel so that that rectangle becomes a trapezoid. Use our magic marker just to carve into it, or show where our cut marks are going to need to be. That's what we're going to cut with our sanding tool. Go ahead and do that. You can see there's still a little bit showing, but I'm going to sand that down with my hand tools now, just to get a finer edge on it. Alright, another trick that we can use to get a smooth edge on plastic on a straight surface is we can use a straight razor blade. If you're really careful, you can just drag the flat edge of a sharp blade along the surface and you get a pretty smooth surface. For the rounded edges, I would still suggest you use a bastard file. Alright, the next thing I'm going to want to do is to add some detail to this part. Again, we're not finished, adding things to it, but we are done with the basic form. So we do have sort of a, trapezoid from the rear edge of it. We do have a bevel on our part, and now I want to add some detail to it. And it's okay to draw on your part, So I'm going to go ahead and just, sketch out some details that I think would be kind of cool. And let's see. After I do that, I'm going to figure out how to make them. Alright, I want a circular part up here because I think that'd be kind of neat, having a little circle and some detail ridging. I'd like to add some scribed lines with some cutouts. And some little random detail parts. Now that looks like scribble scratch right now, but we're going to figure out how to actually make these parts. Now, I'm going to take my circular ruler tool, and I'm going to make a little 3/8 inch circle at the top of my part. It's just the template for another part we're actually going to cut out, but I just want to make sure everything is going to look cool. Go ahead and draw in my detail ridge. I'm going to take a straight edge, I'm going to draw in where I'm going to put my scribe lines. We're going to go ahead and let that wrap around. I'm going to put in some cutouts into my scribe lines, which is going to look like photo etching. It's going to be kind of cool. This is basically what the part's going to look like with some plastic on it. Then I'm going to have some cutouts on the sides. Okay. Now, this is basically, what the part's going to look like two-dimensionally. So we're going to first need to figure out how to make that circle. Cutting circular plastic is kind of fun, and I'll show you a really neat trick that you'll find really useful. Alright, I'm going to take a plastic sheet. It's kind of thick. It's not the plastic sheet that I showed you before, but it's also made by Plastruct, and I'll put a link in the notes at the end of the video. But we're going to take this and cut out the rectangle roughly the size of the part that we want to make. So just mark it with your marker. Grab your disc blade tool and let's cut it out. Now, since this is going to have to be this little circle in here, I'm going to trace the circle in it first, just so I know how much extra stuff I can cut off. Okay, we're going to try to get this in sort of like an octagonal shape, so that way we can do the rest of this, and you'll see where I'm going in a minute. Just follow me. Now this is nowhere near the shape that we need it to be, but that's okay, and I'll show you why. We just need this to be in an edge that's easier to sand, because we're going to mount this piece of plastic to this Dremel and let the Dremel do the sanding for us. Alright, now finding the center of the part that you have is probably crucial, as otherwise it's going to be lopsided. I've marked the center of that roughly, doesn't have to be perfect. And I'm going to take a micro drill, and you can use any kind of drill that you have as long as it has a small enough bit. It has to be a bit the size of the screw that holds this disc blade on. And I'll show you how to do that in a second. But let's go ahead and just make a little drill hole. The drill that I use most often is a little micro drill set made by CML Supply. I think this might have cost me $12, and it's got 30, 40 drill bits in it. And it's just a wonderful little drill bit set. Useful for a number of applications. Alright, take your little micro drill, press down on the spot we've marked, and then just go ahead and drill that part out. Cool. Alright. Next, we're going to take off the drill bit from, or the diamond disc blade from the bit. And it means you're going to leave the bit itself attached to the Dremel. You're just going to unscrew the head on it, because we're going to need this drill bit to mount the plastic to. Alright, I've gone ahead and widened that hole a little bit just to make sure it would match the screw threading. But we're going to take the little screw that would hold on the diamond disc blade, and we're going to go ahead and thread it through the plastic. So we're sort of mounting this plastic like it were the disc blade. Gotta make sure that, oops, the screw goes all the way through the plastic first. Try to make it sort of a tight fit, and don't strip out the plastic if you can help it, as this will help us maintain a tighter grip when we're rotating the plastic and make it easier for us to sand this part. Cool. So now we have our little plastic disc blade, and we're going to use this on our crappy low-grit sandpaper. Alright, now this looks really messy right now, but we have it kind of close to the size that we want. So we're going to get a little bit more delicate sanding stick or something of the sort. Do not use your bastard file for this, you're going to get your bastard file all gunked up. But just, again, some more rough sandpaper glued to a popsicle stick. I'm just going to get it down to about the right size that we want. Alright, I've sanded this down to roughly about the size that I want. It doesn't look like it's circular perfectly because of the marker skewing it, but it's pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and add a bevel to the edge by just letting it rotate some more, but then, you know, applying a beveled sanding edge. So. That way. Obviously, the smoother the sandpaper that you use on this, the finer the surface quality is going to be. So I would suggest using coarse grit when you're trying to get rough shaping, and then higher grit count when you're trying to get a smoother surface. Now we're going to go ahead and detach this piece of plastic from our drill bit. And what we have is a little circular part, which we will add to this in just a moment. Alright, one thing I forgot to mention, or I forgot to plan out ahead, is how I'm going to add that little detail bar to the circle. So what I've decided is I'm gonna go ahead and take a little rectangular rod piece of plastic. I'm going to build it up too high, one that can overlap the circle, one that butts into the circle. I'm going to glue it to the circle before we glue this circle part onto our thruster. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my razor blade and I'm going to cut so I have the part that's going to go on top of the circle. Don't worry, we're going to shave this down a little bit. And then I'm going to have this part of the rectangle shaped to fit over that bevel in the circle. So I'm going to have to shave this down just a little bit. And you can do that with a razor blade, you can do that with a sanding stick, whatever makes you comfortable. I'm going to go ahead and just make a little incision in here. And I'm going to cut it down with my razor blade. Again, be very careful, this is quite sharp. And you see now that that head has a little bit of a bevel to it. Might not match the circle perfectly, but I'll shape it again if I have to. And cool. And it's not a perfect fit, but it doesn't have to be, as our glue can help us fill some of that in. But yeah, you guys get the point. It fits pretty well. Alright, so now we're going to glue the other piece on top of our recently cut piece so that the rectangle comes to the middle of the circle. So we need to mark off where we're going to glue it first. Pull out our super glue. And glue our block onto the other one. Excellent. Position it well, and then let's give that a minute to dry. Now this is dry. We're going to go ahead and cut off the extra. Put our plastic away. And we are left with our little circular part and the little bar that goes over it. And now what we're going to need to do is to sand this little bar down and shape it so that the edges are a little bit rounded and that this is the length that we want. So I'm going to go ahead and take my bastard file. This part's really small, there's no point in bringing out a larger piece of sandpaper. Just drag it along the edges until we get a pretty smooth surface. Okay. Okay. I'm going to bevel the other edge as well, just so that I don't have any parts sticking out when I go to cast this. Alright, I think we're just about ready to glue this to our circle. Alright, now we're going to get that. Which will look really cool once we put it on our thruster. Given the white balance on this camera is a little funky, so yeah, it'll look pretty sweet. Alright, well, let's go ahead and glue the rectangular ridge piece to our circle. Let's try not to use too much extra super glue, as that can make cleanup on our part a little bit difficult. And we're going to cover up the drill hole that we made with our little rectangle. Alright. Cool. Now we have this, which is quite neat. and this goes on top of our little thruster. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and sand the bottom of this, however, to make sure that everything is the same height and flush, so that way when we glue this on the part, it stays flush. Alright, I was going to go ahead and just glue this on here, but I forgot we needed to add the other detailed parts, which would be our little scribed part with some negative space on the side, negative space on the side. The way we're going to do that is by taking thin sheet plastic, which is, let's see, 0.3 millimeters. The part is 91101 by Plastruct. Really thin sheet plastic. We're going to take our hobby knife and cut out some little bits that are roughly the size of our part, because we're just going to glue like an entire sheet on the part and then just cut stuff out. Or lay it over the part, cut stuff out, and then glue it, you know. I guess because once there's glue on it, you can't cut it much anymore. Alright, let's say we cut out a little shape, roughly the size of our part. We are going to need there to be one pretty straight edge. And that straight edge, you see how on our part we have that line that we want there to be. We're basically going to put a sheet here, and then we're going to put a sheet down here, and we're going to leave a gap in between them. And that's where we're going to get our really clean, straight scribe line. It's not really scribed. We're actually building something up instead of carving something out. So this is going to be additive sculpting. But before I do anything, I'm going to cut out that little block that I want out of this sheet. It doesn't have to be exact, just, you know, something that resembles the shape that I wanted. You know, a few millimeters long. The more you do this, the better you'll get at it. It's pretty easy. Want that little shape in there, and that shape is going to go just like that. We're going to glue this sheet on this part, and then we're just going to cut out all the waste. So let's go ahead and do that. Put the glue on the sheet of thin plastic, being careful not to use too much extra that you don't need. Mainly because it's going to leak out the sides and it's going to muddy up that line that we're trying to achieve. So let's go ahead and just apply the super glue. Alright. I'm going to glue this down on the part. Pretty much where I want that gap to be. Yeah, right along that edge. Push it down nice and snug. And we're going to take our other part, we're going to glue it. We're going to glue it with that gap showing. And that'll give us our nice clean panel line. So I'll glue this part right on the gap with the other part. Alright, now we're going to let this dry for a minute, just so it doesn't move. Alright, while that's drying, you can take a pair of what I would call crappy scissors you don't mind getting super glue on, and just kind of trimming most of the excess off. Just cut towards, you know, cut around the edge of it. Doesn't have to be exact because we're going to sand that down, but just kind of do that. You're going to get some super glue on your scissors. So again, crappy scissors. Alright. Now we have this, pretty cool. But we have all this extra stuff sticking out. We're just going to need to remove all that stuff. You can use a razor blade, works really well. Again, be quite careful. And just drag it along the flat edges. can use our scraping as well. And we can use our bastard file now, as long as the super glue is dry. When you are sanding this, try not to sand up like that, because that might peel the sheet up. You just kind of want to sand in one direction, either with the sheet or forcing the sheet down. Because that thin plastic, if it's not glued, it's going to peel up, it's going to bend, and it's just going to make this a messy job. Alright, again, now we have that side. Now we need to go ahead and do the same exact thing, but with right here and right here. Making sure that on this part and on this part, we make that negative cutout for these that we want. Alright, the next thing we're going to need to do is to glue these new little sheet parts down the same way we did with the top. So I'm going to take my super glue, glue the back of this sheet. And lay this down on the part so that it lines up with the top, so that this line can continue to wrap around the side. No worries that this part sticks out so much, we're just going to chop it off right here and then sand it down later. Alright. Take my crappy scissors, cut off the extra. And I'm going to put the other side on as well. And cutting off the excess. Alright, now this part is coming along. You can see the negative space down here, which looks sort of like photo etching. It's kind of cool. But we're going to need to remove these extra flaps before we continue. So let's get some glue down in between the sheet and the part. Kind of squeeze it with a paper towel. And then we're going to, as soon as this dries, we're going to go ahead and sand off these edges. Alright, now we're going to go ahead and glue on the last little bits. Just kind of finishing up that panel line. And don't worry about this stuff sticking out. Again, we're going to shave that off. Alright, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and wait for these to dry, and then I'm just going to cut those extra bits off and sand these edges down carefully. Remember, you can use your razor blade to scrape along the edges as you need to. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and clean this part up so we can get it ready to add the circle part on top of. Alright, I've gone ahead and cleaned this up a bit, so it's not perfect, but it is generally pretty smooth. We're going to go ahead, since this face sheet is all smooth sheet plastic, there's really no sanding to be done. It's all been replaced by a smooth surface, so we just need to go ahead and glue that part on. So we're going to do that. apply a decent amount of glue to our little circular part. We're going to apply it to the top of our thruster. And that part is done. Now there's two more things I think we need to do. We need to add thruster housing to the back, which is just going to be a frame that goes around the trapezoid part that will make it look like a thruster. And it's just going to be 4 walls made of this little rectangular rod. They're going to go around the outside of that. And this part would just be painted black or whatnot. We could add venting if we wanted to later on. And the next thing we need to do after that, and the last thing, is to add a hole right here so that it can mount to that peg. The peg will be the last thing we do, as it's generally pretty easy. What we need to do right now is to make the frame for the rear of the thruster. The difficulty lies in that now that we've added this bevel, this rectangle is not going to go against it flush and be straight at the same time, so we need to shave down part of this rectangle so that it's the same angle as that bevel. Pretty easy. Just grab a razor blade, scrape it along the edge. All right. And our rod will go on there pretty well. We can straighten it out more if we need to later. But we're going to put a rod on the top and on the bottom, and then we'll do the side parts. Now I've added the 2 beveled rods to the rear of this. I'm going to have to cut off the excess using some diagonal cutters, or dikes. Alright, now we have that. We still need to add in the rods right here and right here, so we're going to have to cut out some space for them to fit in. So I'm just going to go ahead and use my razor blade to cut out the top and the bottom part so that this could fit in like that. Let's do that on both sides. Again, be very careful. This is one of the most dangerous parts of a build, and you can get some severe cuts in your finger if you're not careful. You might get some even if you are careful. Make sure you're also always working with really sharp blades. I know that sounds contradictory, but if they're dull, they're more likely to jam and then skip into your finger, which you can see the obvious downside of. Okay. Once we have enough space that we can glue these in, we will do so. And when we do it, I've allowed enough space so that this rod will stick out just a little bit, thickness-wise. So that way when it's glued in place and we don't have any extra and we sand it down, these walls to this rear thruster frame will be thinner than this piece is. I've cut it down to roughly this shape. Again, don't worry about all these things sticking out that seem sort of uneven. We're going to fix those in a minute. To remove pretty quickly. Yeah, that larger side piece we're going to go ahead and just sand down quickly. We're going to do this to all 4 sides. to get everything pretty smooth and the same height. And on the back side. Use our razor blade to scrape out the excess. And the back end is going to look sort of like that. And seeing the top is a little bit thicker, which is okay because it goes with the part design. But if we wanted to make it thinner, we could always bevel the back a little bit just on the top. I'm going to drag my razor blade around the corners to get a decent bevel to it. We don't want our edges to be too sharp. Now for the most part we have a finished part. We just need to add in that hole like I spoke of before. Now for it to fit onto this is a peg. We're going to need female end of the peg to just snap it on. I have these rods that are plastic hollow cylinders that are similar to the plastic rectangular rods, except for these are hollow. So I'm just going to chop off a little bit of this rod. And the next thing we're going to do after cutting the cylinder is we're going to make a hollow for that cylinder to rest in. So we're just going to drill out a spot larger than this, put this in it, and then seal the cracks with some superglue and baking powder. Alright, next we're going to take our Dremel, putting a small drill bit in it. I've marked off the center of the back side of my piece, pretty much where I'm going to drill out to add the cylinder. So I've marked it. I'm going to go ahead and drill it. I can tell when I've gone through the part because it gives a little bit when it's going into the negative of our little circle part we added. Now obviously this is not anywhere near the size of this. I'm just going to keep increasing the drill bit size until I have a hollow large enough to just drop that part into. Alright, now I've drilled the back of this out and I've made the hole much larger than it needs to be. A mistake of sorts, but one that will give us a chance to learn something else, which is how to make little plastic shims when you need to fill holes. So I'm going to start off by gluing the cylinder that I need into the negative space that I've made. Just by, putting a little bit around the edges. Putting the cylinder where I want it to go. Letting it harden a little bit. And then dropping some more super glue down into the hole that we've created. Okay. Now, saying as I've done that, I have a bunch of space around the cylinder. I'm going to take these little plastic shims that I've made and just kind of drop them into the space to fill that space up with plastic. Don't worry about all this stuff sticking out. Every bit of it's going to get chopped off and sanded smooth. And the parts that we don't fill with plastic, we are going to put super glue in and fill with baby powder. Alright, put some more super glue in there. this looks a horrible mess, but it'll sand down smooth in just a few minutes. Let's let this dry first. Alright, now I'm going to take my Dremel tool and shave off all of that excess. And I was careful not to apply too much force, because the goal is not to remove the cylinder, but just the waste. Alright. Now that it's closer to the main part, I can go ahead and put on a sanding bit. Now the back side is almost ready. We just need to put some super glue and baby powder down where all the rough spots are. Again, you can do this with putty as well. Put a paper towel down as it's much easier to clean up this way. And you can sand this almost immediately. And it's almost flush. Run our faster file on it. Do this a couple more times, and the part is then ready for some finish sanding, and then priming, and then either ready for you to put on your model or for you to cast. I'm going to go ahead and clean this part up, do some finish sanding, and put down a layer of primer on it so that you can see what the part looks like cleaned up and primed. Alright guys, well, here's our part after we sprayed a little gunmetal lacquer on it. Still some parts that could probably be sanded a little bit better, but you get the idea. Yeah, backside could still use a little bit of sanding. Not completely smooth, but this is what we made. Our angled deflector can just snap right onto that and get our angled thrust. And this concludes the introduction to plastic model scratch building and sculpting. One more thing before we go, I just wanted to say thank you to Cam, who suggested that I do this video quite a while back. I haven't had a chance up until now, but I hope you guys find this useful. And if there's anything you guys need that you didn't see, feel free to leave comments below. And if you like the video, you found it useful, just do me a favor and either pass the video on, subscribe to me on YouTube, or just tell somebody about it, just so we can get some hits and build up the notoriety of this, so more people can get involved in the hobby and find this stuff easier to do. All right, thanks.